Good evening. My name is Jaimes Leroy from the Berlin Institute of Technology, and I'm here to discuss the expert testimony for Team New Zealand Project 4, which consists of Mr. Michael Gentry, Mr. Henry Perez, and Mr. James Williams from the University of Maryland. Our introduction is, in order to provide an adequate expert testimony in court, it is important to provide an overall summary of the findings throughout these past three projects. Each project will be explained in detail within each section of this compilation. Section 1 will consist of the Project 1 that entailed the Cybersecurity Policy and Baseline Analysis Report. The particular items from this project will be highlighted as the system security risks and vulnerabilities, international regulations, and the final deliverable. In Section 2, there are a number of items that are deliverable, which include the cybersecurity risk assessment, the vulnerability matrix, incident response plan, our service level agreement, our 5i indicator sharing report, and then ultimately our final forensics report. These 5 will be discussed in brief detail. Section 3 consists of 4 deliverables to include the Cyber Operations and Risk Management Briefing, Intelligence Debriefing, our Lessons Learned video, and Forensic Investigation Report. Each step will be explained in each project along with the actual deliverable as shown in Appendix A, B, and C. So our agenda today will be our Global Economic Summit, our preparatory exercises, our team agreement, our research of country policies, our determination of bad actors, our chain of custody, our international policy matrix, our network security checklist, our system security risk and vulnerability report, our security baseline report, our transnational legal compliance report, a discussion of nations behaving badly, a cybersecurity risk assessment, a vulnerability matrix, an incident response plan, service level agreement, our 5i indicator sharing report, an overall forensics report, a discussion of the tools used for this analysis, and then finally a Wireshark analysis summary. In continuation, cybersecurity has become a daily conversation in the world of technology that has exhibited exponential growth. The enemy has become increasingly adaptive to any and all protective measures that cybersecurity experts have put in place. An organizational cybersecurity posture is tested every day by internal and external sources. Internal includes things that are risk assessments, threat analysis, and asset identification. Externally, there are a multitude of attacks that can cripple an organization, such as denial of service, malware, or phishing. In order to capture the full spectrum of cybersecurity and how it affects an organization, several evaluations must be conducted. This will be done in 3 different parts. Economic Summit, Nations Behaving Badly, and then ultimately the lockdown. Each part will be discussed in detail and will cover a multitude of areas that will revolve around keeping an organization's cybersecurity posture up to date and as sound as possible. These parts are directly related to the 3 sections mentioned in the abstract of this report. So for the Economic Summit, so there were a number of steps that we tried to accomplish. One was the preparatory exercises. This step was used to prepare the students to provide some basic review of the tools, technologies, and methods that we used in beginning of the cyber adventure of foreign intrigue at this Global Economic Summit. The second step was establishing a team agreement. This team agreement was needed in order to lay out a timeline for which each of the deliverables was due, and then to ensure that each team member knew their designated roles. Team New Zealand had 3 members, so work was divided evenly. The agreement also kept members accountable and ensured that each member stayed on task. Step 3 was research each country's policies. The purpose of the step was to help other countries in attendance to understand the policy framework within which Team New Zealand will have to operate in. It was important not to assume that all countries apply cybersecurity in the same way with the same intentions. The end product for the step was to research those policies that were a part of New Zealand's cybersecurity posture. Next, we develop a network security checklist. The network security checklist was created to form a process in which New Zealand will be able to ensure a secure network for our information. The list was further collaborated in the following steps. The next steps were system security risk and vulnerability reports. The system security risk and vulnerability report worked in hand with the network security checklist to ensure that it went more in depth. The report was one of the key documents that drove the organization's cybersecurity infrastructure because in order to defend against vulnerabilities, those vulnerabilities must be identified and known. The report listed the different threats to authentication and credentials, and it also explained how social engineering is a threat to those credentials. It shed a lot of light on public key infrastructure and how to protect access to it. In the end state, it described leapfrogging and how it affects multiple networks. This report, along with the network security checklist, hopefully explained that to the overall audience. Next, we develop a security baseline report. This baseline report is where the bulk of the work really came from. It includes reports from several previous steps to include the use of Wireshark to establish a network baseline. When Wireshark is used, we essentially develop a scan to determine whether there were any unusual activity, whether there was any unusual activity on the network. By using that information, we were able to determine the types of vulnerabilities and associated attacks distributed throughout the computing module. And by using those principles, we were able to identify certain digital signatures, and then we created screenshots to show whether we may have vulnerabilities. Lastly, we created a transnational legal compliance report. So again, as we're working with a number of other countries, we were able to work with other countries to develop a policy matrix that were created in previous steps to identify and modify a digital forensic environmental review and analysis of those international laws and regulations to deal with data acquisition, preservation, analysis, and transfer. This environmental review and analysis was a forensic analysis report for the final deliverable and was associated with our transnational legal compliance report. We had to do this actual report in order to ensure that all of our information was analyzed. So, in closing, our final deliverable consists of all of the subsequent steps leading up to it. It was made up of 3 parts: our cyber policy report, security baseline report, and our forensic analysis report. The cyber policy report consists of the following, which was the cyber policy matrix, which was a spreadsheet or table that represented a matrix of our 5 country policies and the laws that govern that the government has instituted to address cybersecurity management and technology. With a comparison with other nations' policies and international laws and policies to deal with the acquisition, preservation, analysis, and transfer of data, which will also be included in our ultimate transnational legal compliance report. That report itemized appraisal and for the compliance requirements, which are common among 5 nations. And then by using that report, we're able to review and determine which international initiatives will most likely result in the cooperation of all the nations at the summit. Additionally, the security baseline report, which consisted of the attribution report, our team identified the rogue nation responsible for the breach documents and detailed the processes and determined the impact to the international relationships. Our network security checklist, which was an inventory of network software and hardware components used to ensure multi-level security. And then lastly, our security rich vulnerability, in which we identified threats to the communication systems and potential impacts to any of our ability to communicate. The final part of our deliverable will be the forensic analysis report, which contained the following, which would be a chain of custody which tracks all of the evidence that we've captured. The environmental report, in which we do an assessment of both the legal, environmental, and the security postures allowed for us to continue to pursue any legal action against this actor. So when we looked at our nations behaving badly, and again, we wanted to protect the homeland from cyber attacks, which takes a lot of planning and collaboration between both different entities within the cybersecurity industry. During the economic summit, our security specialists worked in conjunction with other nations to establish a baseline of our network. Obtaining a baseline for the organizational network provides us with an overview of the current security controls in which the organization operates on a daily basis. This approach allows us to effectively compare regular system operations with suspicious activity occurring within the network. Despite all of the work invested in our project in terms of establishing a baseline, system design, and establishing security protocols, a breach can still occur. The second project focused on cybersecurity readiness, incident handling, and forensic reporting. The project required students and participants in this exercise to be prepared to deal with cybersecurity risks that may affect the organization's network infrastructure. Based on suspicious activity report received during the project, the security team was tasked to implement several controls to mitigate possible breach, and these controls included a cybersecurity risk assessment, a vulnerability matrix, incident response plan, service level agreement, and a 5i indicator sharing report along with the forensic report to show our results. During the cybersecurity risk assessment phase of Project 2, a cybersecurity risk assessment was conducted to evaluate the current network security posture. This allows the team to determine risk associated to weaknesses found in the initial baseline report from the first project. The risk assessment addressed several security controls that may be affected by a cyber threat, and the following areas were discussed in the risk assessment, which included authentication, authorization, access control, common vulnerabilities that all affect the infrastructure, common vulnerabilities that affect the enterprise or any organization include the people, the technologies, or the security policies. The security controls mentioned above are the subject of exploitation if such systems are not properly configured. Based on information gathered during the first project, the baseline analysis, most of the configuration was acceptable. Although the findings showed that the security controls were properly configured, common vulnerabilities such as employees may pose a risk to the security. Human error is always a major factor in breaches. In addition, insider threats account for approximately 75% of all security breach incidents, and as a result, another risk factor that we addressed in this report was the technology issues that were aimed toward web servers, and we discovered that misconfiguration of those websites and web servers were a risk to the infrastructure, since it may actually expose the network and the organization to a variety of attacks. Attacks such as SQL injections, butter overflow, among others, may pave the way for a hacker to exploit those vulnerabilities and subsequently gain access to the network. Lastly, security policies, if not properly written, may not convert all areas needed to properly secure our network. A few examples of policy include the following. The policy may be too specific. It may not cover aspects of a cybersecurity crime. Security laws and regulations make it difficult to balance security and convenience. We live in a world where everyone must have access to all of their information all the time. So as we increase security, we also diminish convenience and the ability to access the network, and we must balance that. And then lastly, persons responsible for writing such policies may not be experienced enough to be in a position to properly protect the network. All too often, we are faced with the fact that we are hiring younger and less experienced people, and they may not have the experience or the background to be able to properly protect our network. Our vulnerability matrix was based on findings in a security risk assessment. A vulnerability matrix that was created to further analyze potential attacks that the organization may be exposed to. Here's a quick snapshot for the vulnerability matrix. And what you'll see is the risk, the vulnerability, the category, the threat, and then subsequently the attack vectors, and more importantly, what the mitigation action was that we put in place to reduce that threat. So what we do is we list the threats, we list the impacts based on a high-low scoring system, and then we compare those risks necessary to implement a strategy plan designed to properly mitigate those threats and implement measures to prevent those threats in the future. Our incident response plan was another essential tool that was used to essentially prevent potential impacts of a threat and to reduce the impacts of a potential incident by quickly and efficiently producing and managing a document which obviously determined whether a breach was detected, and then when that suspicious activity was conducting the appropriate analysis when it became available. That plan presented multiple incident scenarios which affected the organization's security. However, it also provided steps on how to properly mitigate those and contain those incidents. Typically, an incident response plan is not expected immediately to react, but the system integrity check needs to be conducted in order to determine whether the system integrity breach occurred by comparing the baselines, checking intrusion detection, or preventing system logons. So one of the things we did was we conducted an incident response plan to address the organizational environmental conditions and logistics of all mechanisms to keep those essential systems running during a disaster. That plan represented an all-in-one guide for personnel to follow in the event that we have a breach that allowed the organizational continuity to continue. And what we tried to do was address the following areas in detail, which was identifying the degradation of roles and responsibilities, defining phases of the incident response, providing incident response steps in a scenario based on a denial of service attack or loss of communication, define all of the activities, authorities, and really identifying who has what roles and responsibilities, defining the triggering conditions, addressing each report and product throughout the incident response activity, addressing all the tools, techniques, and technology used to mitigate the incident, and then providing the coordinating paths and parties to which were involved in mitigating those attempts to attack our network. And then lastly, establishing security controls and hacking, and then obviously conducting the appropriate recovery activities to get our network back on track. As a result, we had to establish a service level agreement, which means that, as Team New Zealand, we had to determine that all nations participating in the summit were affected by the attack. The attack targeted multiple systems, affecting latency and even connectivity to some of the networks. And as a result, it was determined that a service level agreement needed to be created. The purpose of that document was to ensure that all services rendered by each nation remain available at all times. And then what that did was it minimized accidental service interruptions if one party intended to conduct activities that may affect another party. So what we want to do with the service level agreement was provide an agreement to ensure that when we're not testing related denial of service attacks, that we wouldn't prevent another service from conducting their information or their actions on the network. We had to provide network metrics for network availability. We had to deal with the issue of bandwidth, because we did have some limited bandwidth issues. And we had to agree to monitor the network across all networks from the internet service provider. Lastly, we had to make sure that we shared our reports and that we maintained the ability to access the internet service provider information to allow us to be able to defend our network. And then finally, we had to institute testing for each team's configurations within the internet service provider. The conditions addressed in the service level agreement addressed primarily, denial of service attacks, bandwidth limitations, and then obviously the availability of the network. And then we also spent a lot of energy and time developing a 5i indicator sharing report. And what we did was we analyzed the PCAP file captured during our network anomaly report. And what we discovered was we know the cause of the attack. It was important to share these findings with the other teams participating in the summit. This approach made the teams aware of the previous attack and to be on the lookout for similar attacks in the future. In addition, the indicator sharing report provides key information on the attack's capabilities and how to mitigate this kind of attack in the future, particularly for denial of service. The denial of service attack was used by hackers to attack specific systems and interrupt their ability and availability, or to basically start a denial of service so we can't access the network. That was their intent. And there's a lot of information that is provided about how a denial of service attack can happen. But what we did was, to prevent that attack, we wanted to install basically good antivirus and anti-malware software to help us understand. We established a very substantial firewall, and we made sure that the firewall was configured to prevent any outside agencies or bad actors from getting into our network. And then we made sure that our protocols and our software was up to date. So during the course of this, we created a network forensic analysis report so we could establish that one of our web servers, due to the suspicious activity and do our own internal monitoring, we were able to send out alerts that a member of the system's admin staff identified that a portion of our server was unresponsive. And then what they did was, our system admin, he implemented very, very specific troubleshooting techniques to investigate the occurrence. And then as a result of those investigations, the system admin noticed that the web server was still powered and accessed via a specific console. So because we weren't able to ping that console, we determined that maybe someone had gained unauthorized access to one of our consoles. So we use Wireshark and we use UDP Unicom to basically do an analysis of the type of activity. And what we found was the affected web server was indeed experiencing several cyber attacks from a system within the network. And then according to the initial forensic analysis, the initial attack occurred on June 8th at about 10 o'clock at night when no one was around. The system involved an incident which we identified a local IP, which was one of our local systems. And what we found was there was both a denial of service attack, a cross-site scripting attack, command shell execution attack, directory transversal attack, a brute force attack to try to get passwords, an arbitrary file access and elevation of privileges to give someone else access to admin rights. And so we clearly